My name is Angelina Avedano, and this is Interspace, where we explore the spaces between us. Join me for discussions on a series of realities with thinkers, writers, thought leaders, and artists. Dr. Rosalie Bouck is a mythologist and educator who specializes in ancient Mexican myth and ritual. Rosalie holds degrees in political science, philosophy, and mythological studies, and has been featured on the Science Channel and National Geographic Mexico Channel. In her current project, Decolonizing Narratives, she explores the mythologies that inform American culture in both harmful and healthy ways. Her work advocates careful listening to and learning from myths of other cultures to help move past colonialist practices and into a more just and vibrant future. Welcome, Dr. Rosalie Bouck. Hi, Rosalie. Thank you so much for joining me today in what I know is going to be a fascinating conversation about your work and how living and thinking mythically can bring radical ideas back into our consciousness.
Yes, thank you for having me. I'm really looking forward to talking to you, Angelina.
I have been very intrigued by what I'm seeing on your website and Instagram posts about decolonizing narratives. So could you please talk about your vision for decolonizing narratives, what that means, and how you're going about doing this work?
Yeah, so the project itself is really taking the mythological conversation into a social and political sphere. I draw on my background of political science and political philosophy to address some of the questions that are really relevant in that world, but I take a look at it through the narrative lens to try and get a stronger grasp on some of the values that are laying at the base of it all, the foundational values. So I think that, as many of us mythologists do, we're all living in some sort of mythology. You can look at that in different ways. Collectively, in the United States, we are living in a mythology that's very influenced by colonialism, and I think that's a lot of the problems. A lot of the problems that we have in terms of oppression and ongoing racism and institutionalized racism really come from the fact that these values are embedded in our narrative, and they are colonialist. So decolonizing narratives is both talking about narratives that are decolonizing, that do work, that takes us out of a colonialist mindset. And it's also talking about decolonizing the narratives that we have. So looking at the pieces, like how are these racist? How are these perpetuating these problematic behaviors, and starting to pull them apart in a deconstructive way.
That is such important work, and you and I both know that academics have been largely responsible for theorizing about these kinds of ideas. However, can we talk a bit about how we might identify them in our day-to-day lives? What I mean to say is, for folks who believe that this is just academic jargon, what would you say to illustrate how colonialism is indeed something that is affecting all of us?
Well, it's very tricky, and that's a lot of the reason that I have come to myth with this topic and trying to discuss these issues that really do stay in more of an academic space. They're things I've looked at for a long time. But yeah, I've been interested in these questions for a long time. What is a just society? These are the things that I studied in my undergraduate and took seriously for a long time when I went into doing community work and working in different communities through nonprofits. What is just? How are we actually growing just communities? Are we? Is it possible in the frameworks we're working in? And I think these questions actually really, if you get deep with them, they are mythological questions. And they also, when you look at them from a mythological lens, you can take them a little bit out of that super intellectual space that we usually discuss these things in. And they become more accessible in kind of a feeling space, an immediate space, a space that we can look at it. So how you do it is very hard. And that's really what the whole project is starting to talk about. I weave together classical myth in some cases, and then I weave together ideas of just how narrative affects our social structures. And I draw a lot from different thinkers, and there's a lot of social activists and organizing work that talks about narrative. So I use that a little bit to bring it home. I use the classical myths to amplify some of the issues. And then I try to ground us in looking at things like, how does individualism play out? And how is that a part of it? What is the colonialist narrative? In general, and just starting to talk about, for instance, individualism, which is a huge backbone of the colonialist narrative, the modern American narrative. And then I talk about, what does individualism really mean? Well, if you look at it in different contexts, you can start to understand that individualism actually doesn't work that well with connectivity and inclusivity, and that these are narratively separate, and they're contained in different value systems. So that's one place that we start to bump up against a problem. And it is ultimately connected to all these other pieces of the narrative that we have to really look at and start to change from the inside out, I think, to really make movement, because all of our social structures are based on this narrative that holds things true, like individualism, extreme goal orientation, things that are inherently patriarchal and over, toxic, masculine to the point of being toxic. And that's all a part of a big narrative, and we need to be able to grab it as a whole and start to talk about it. And I think that's what myth or narrative work does for us, is to be able to step out of the policy and kind of find our ways in through pieces like individualism or capitalism, and then start to get really in the whole framework so that we can assess the land and say, how do we get out of here? How is this working? How is this not working?
Rosalie, your work looks closely at the very fabric of American identity. And when you start destabilizing or pushing up against the foundation of American identity, ideas like individualism, capitalism, and the American dream, there's a tremendous amount of suspicion and resistance. The way we see ourselves as Americans is so married to this kind of goal-oriented, power-driven success model that it often turns a blind eye to the destructive elements embedded in it. And now more than ever, it seems we're really invested in holding on to an American identity that sees itself as unique and separate and better than others. When you start questioning that, you're going to come up against a lot of resistance, I would think.
Yeah, you're right. There is a lot of resistance. I go back and forth, honestly, between being sort of charged by the resistance, because it's like, oh, this really tells me something's here, and being discouraged by it, because obviously it's hard to present your ideas and have people say, oh, I just don't like that. But I think I just always really ground in the fact that this is incredibly important to our world. It's really how I see the world. It's been a track that I've been on most of my life. And I think I just really have to accept that, people do push back. People don't like it, but that just tells you all the more the work is so important. And I've had some pretty strong, I wouldn't even say conflicts, but almost standoffs with people who just say, I'm uncomfortable with this. And even in the world of myth, I've had kind of, friendly arguments, but that are heated. Just in the work of like Joseph Campbell, I recently had a back and forth with people who, and I was saying, Campbell actually is not pushing the Christian myth. And here's why I think that is. And I think that he has a problem with the hierarchy embedded in it. And people are saying, no, he's okay with it. He's good with it. And but you can't say that because it's Joseph Campbell, and that makes me uncomfortable. And I just have to say, here's what I feel, but also here's the academic aspect. Here's the quotes, and I can kind of lay it out for you. And sometimes the most you can do for people is to make them uncomfortable. I guess that's really the answer to it. Is I deeply think that discomfort is a good thing. And if I feel in my heart like I'm doing it, that this is my justice work, this is my work to push society into a healthy direction, then at the end of the day, that's what I live with, is whether or not I did what I thought was right.
Absolutely. And being in the classroom myself and having these conversations with my colleagues and in the world, I'm noticing that as these discussions unfold, and words like toxic masculinity and patriarchy and colonialism enter the conversation, many times people become very polarized. We get into a kind of standoff posture and become extremely defensive, and the conversation gets shut down. No dialogue can happen in that space. It's the exact opposite of that connectivity and collective concern that you're talking about. And there's a suspicion that one side must conquer the other. So how does your work avoid falling into the trap of perpetuating the same kind of separation and defensiveness and animosity that has been at the root of patriarchy and toxic masculinity?
Yeah, it's so true. It's so true. That's a really tricky thing. And I think there's a certain amount of sort of like a little bit of an idea jujitsu that goes on with that. I'd say that my approach primarily is that I really emphasize that the goal is the community and the collectivity and the moving to a new era, and that affects all of us. And I really try to appeal to people's interest in truly deeply moving forward. And I also think that many people, when they start to hear me talk, I usually have a very strong response of people saying, yeah, you're right. There is something, if I presented, there is something that's just not working as a whole. Like, we're trying to move forward, and I can kind of see how these values perpetuate that. And then from there, I enter into more of a discussion about how masculinity and femininity play into it. And I'm also very forward and upfront with that. I think that the answer is right now to do some embracing of femininity, but that both is very much a job of men as well as women. And also, the ultimate isn't that I want to overthrow men. It's that the idea is to come into a balance. And I feel that very strongly. And I've had some conflict with other people who do work with goddesses and femininity because of almost that exact reason, that I think it's really not about a takeover. I really believe in growing the femininity and the feral femininity, but it's really just so it can all come back into conversation. And to be honest, I think that even men or people who might be, this whole topic might make them a little nervous or get defenses going. When we talk about that, I think so many people just say, yeah, I gotta say that does make sense. It's just becoming more and more clear that we're hitting a wall here, and there's something seems to be out of sync. And so when you talk about it that way and really de-emphasize the fact that it's just a problem of, patriarchy is a symptom. It's not really the problem. And men aren't the problem, and masculinity isn't the problem. It just happens to be overemphasized to the detriment of all of us right now.
I totally agree. And I know we have men and boys in our lives. We love and adore them. I find it so refreshing to realize that we don't have to separate these ideas. We can be working to break down patriarchy and toxic masculinity, not to emasculate men. I love my husband. I love his maleness. I have 3 sons. I love them as men. But in order to embrace the masculine, we can now move into an era that sees that it doesn't have to be one or the other. That kind of mentality, no matter which side it's coming from, is only a continuation of the same kind of destructive, competitive ideology that has created many of the problems we're facing today.
Absolutely. And I think that, for me, having a son, I have a 3-year-old son, and that activated so much of this for me because I want my son also to not be trapped in a toxic masculine society. I see men all around me that I think if they're not very clear on it themselves, it seems obvious sometimes to me that they would feel happier if they felt this like more connection to the feminine in the world and lived in a space that held femininity more highly. I don't want my son or my daughter to be locked in some sort of, it comes down to gender roles and whatnot too. Like, I don't want them to have to feel this extreme masculinity or extreme femininity, but my goal is to have us as a culture and as individuals express the same ability to just have both operating, being fluid, and being vibrant in us. I mean, that's really important, as it is with any principles. It's just that things should be flowing. That's what it really comes down to, that things should be flowing. There should be a balance.
I want to come back to something you said earlier. You brought up this idea of the feral feminine. Can you tell me what you mean by that, and how it works to bring about the kind of change we're both discussing here?
Yeah, feral femininity, I think, is so critical to all of this. And what feral femininity really means to me is creating space for a much more diverse expression of the feminine. And a lot of kind of goddess studies and things do a little bit of a head tilt to this. We often will honor Kali or that destructive energy, but I think that it goes even further. I think that this the feral feminine is destructive, and it or can be, and it's fierce and it's scary, and it's something that every woman knows in themselves, a part of themselves that they maybe even feel kind of ashamed about, and it's something in society that we don't have a lot of examples or icons of, because our feminine tends to be very nurturing. It's very influenced, whether or not we like it, by the Christian myth and the Virgin Mary and all of our saints in the Christian world, the Catholic world, being essentially helpers, healers in a very limited, almost meek often way. And this is where I draw so much energy from the Mesoamerican tradition, because all of their feminine figures are very loving, but in a fierce way. They're nurturers, they're mothers, they'll kill you, they're snake-headed, they are everything. And all of those things. And I think one really critical thing, one big eye-opener to me about feral femininity actually was when I started to study Mexica or Aztec mythology and culture. It became really clear to me that in a lot of senses, war for them was a feminine action. Not always, but often. And that goes to show you that in our mind, in our culture, we would never think of that as femininity being that confronting and that even violent. But violence is an extreme that you see in myths to kind of prove a point often, or sometimes in cultures like the Aztecs. But feral femininity is explosive, it's intense, and it's revolutionary. It's really what changes things. It's what takes us into and through the darkest hour. I feel that's a very feminine energy. And it's also really representative of the uncertainty of difficult times where everything feels like it's lost, like we've been in for the past year. The way you make your way through that, to me, my reading of myth, especially influenced by Mesoamerican myths, is that that's a feminine space, and it's a feral feminine space. It's wild. You have to give up knowing where you're going. You have to give up understanding what's happening, and you have to hand yourself over in this way that you would to, your whatever your version of the divine mother is, and say, okay, guide me. And that's the feral feminine that we're really kind of still trying to repress, but it's needing to come up now, and it's really what the response to extreme toxic masculinity is that's how we get rebalanced, is that conversation between the extreme principles.
As you're talking about that, I can't help but think about what we've seen over this past year, and also so that we can get out of our heads and apply it more specifically to our lives. Do you think that the violence and the outcry we saw over this past summer, alongside what we saw at the Capitol building in January of 2021, can you speak to your view on these expressions and how they play out in a kind of mythological dynamic?
Yeah, I think that the violent uprisings, like over the, police brutality, I guess is it this past summer or spring? It's all kind of a blur now, but things like that very much have a tone of feral femininity. And the reasons why are that they're largely unplanned. They come from a deep, feral place. There's a wildness to it. We've just got to. The people are moved by this energy that's just unstoppable, and it also grows in the communal space. The more that we say, yeah, let's do this. Yeah, let's do this. And we feel the communal with it, which is a very feminine and even feral feminine space. We feel energized by that. The other thing is that we often will ascribe goals to these movements and to these uprisings, which, makes sense. That's what we do in this culture. But there is a certain aspect to it that's like you'll always see with these kind of uprisings when there's these sudden protests or, kind of collective outbursts, if you will, that it's really just reactive. There's a certain space that's not led by a goal, which is a very masculine thing. There's a certain space that's just like, this is injustice. This is wrong. I feel moved by the seat of my being and I want to say something. Whereas, like the protests, if you will, or the riots at the Capitol, and there's really less of a true sense of sort of just community organic uprising that happens with it. There might be like a group mind, group think aspect of like, yeah, let's just do it. But if you really look at it, they're coming from different places. They're really asking for different things at heart. And they're just expressions of different energy in that way.
So you don't see them in their reactivity as being expressions of the same kind of feral feminine energy?
I don't. I think that, and I guess I've never thought about that too deeply, but I don't. Just when I observe it and feel into it and watch it, it doesn't seem the same. When it's just even in their actions, going into the White House and then doing these things that feel really kind of ego-based to me, which is very individualistic. Like, oh, now I'm going to take a picture in so-and-so's office, or I'm going to haul out with this because it's going to look really cool. Like, that's so ego individualist. It's really not this coming from the same place, because what you see when you see these uprisings around like police brutality, there's not a lot of I in it. There's not a lot of me. There's just like, things are wrong with us. And I'm not trying to get my picture taken as like, that's not, the goal isn't to kind of prove yourself. It really seems like the goal is to connect and bring out a different energy. So I think in all these different, you kind of have to be a mythological detective. I think it's like that doesn't feel like the feminine. That feels actually like kind of a increasingly impotent masculine war energy. That's what it feels like to me. It's like, it's not even going that well because that's not working it doesn't have as much sort of collective energy behind it.
You also talk a lot about the wasteland in your work, and I was hoping you could help me understand how you see the wasteland showing up in our world today.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. It's a huge in my mind and in my work. And what's really interesting is that I wrote my dissertation on a lot of it. I talk about the wasteland, and I finished writing. I was writing this all through the beginning of last year, finishing the writing in April. So as I'm writing about the wasteland and what that means from a cultural perspective, I'm watching the pandemic set in, and it's kind of had this weird feeling like, oh my God, I was drawing a lot from just watching it unfold, which is to say that even from a theoretical perspective, when I started working with the wasteland and the motif of the wasteland, it had so many of the same aspects of what we see, what we've seen over the last year. And essentially the way I understand the wasteland, and when I read the wasteland, for me, it's, the wasteland is a motif that's usually associated with the Grail legends, and, made famous by T.S. Eliot's, in popular culture, T.S. Eliot's incredible poem. And those are all deeply influential to me. But what I did is when I was deep in Mesoamerican myth and culture, I found that there was something that really felt like the wasteland. So I kind of took a Mesoamerican lens and looked back on the Grail legends and back at T.S. Eliot, and I'm reading it through that lens. So to me, what the wasteland is essentially is a place where everything stops. Everything stops, and it's a product of hypermasculinity. I think that everything again is in conversation. And when the culture is and life is for all of us and shared and individually, and when one part of the conversation gets too amplified, like in a culture, that masculine aspect stops engaging with the feminine aspect, and we can talk a little bit more about how corn sort of brings us all together, but it goes to a place where it's stagnant. It can no longer go through the cycles of existence and the cosmic cycles that we are meant to be in as individuals and collectively. And this is very much embedded in the Mesoamerican worldview. The Mayans talk about this, the Aztecs talk about this, Teotihuacanos talk about this. And so when one part of the cycle gets too amplified, my reading is that it has to die. And that's the wasteland. That's when in Mesoamerican literature, the wasteland, they don't call it a wasteland, but I see it as a wasteland. It's literally plague. It's literally economy tanking. It's literally going from a utopian civilization, in kind of in Western view of having all the commodities, all the material possessions, all the access to education, all the amenities, and then it hitting a sudden wall. And my reading says that hitting that sudden wall is actually because it detached from the feminine values, and that what has to happen is you go through a wasteland, and then the question is, how do you get out? And that's really where the femininity comes in. But the wasteland is when everything's going great until it stops because it's disconnected. That's the imbalance is gone, or the balance is gone.
And so would you say that's where we are or where we've been?
Yeah. So I would say that's where we've been. I think we're trying to get out of it. So I definitely think that's what the last year has been, where it's just this sense in our personal lives and collectively of it's not working. It's just broken. It just feels broken. Everybody I know seems to feel at a stagnancy in their personal lives or their work lives in some way. Clearly, culturally, we've really hit a dead end. Right now we have a new president in office, and we're hoping everything we have a vaccine, but yeah, I'd say in the last year, we've hit all those dead ends. We can't enjoy our culture anymore. Jobs are lost. We have a president who is nothing but sort of this extreme manifestation that feels very harmful to many of us. That's hitting the wall. And where we're at right now is figuring out how to get out of that. And what I think in my reading of Mesoamerican myth is that you come out of that through accepting the death of things. That's the first step, is just accepting loss and is saying, oh, okay, how are we going to regroup? We really see this, and when we see this, that this need is for change is done, and then really letting those feminine values come in and begin to reorient and re-educate to say, here's how we're going to get back on track, as we actually need a total assessment of our value system and some pretty significant changes. So I think that we're in a time right now in these last weeks where the vaccine and, and a new president in office, and we're starting to feel some movement. But my thought and what I expect is that until we can do some actually still deeper work, this gives us the opportunity. The doors are open, but we still have to do that deeper values work. It's not just going to change now.
No, because something that comes to me as I listen to you talk about that is thinking about, I know we both tread very carefully and are aware that, half of the population feels very strongly. We're just divided, kind of right down the middle. Mm-hmm. And to say that one side is life-giving and somehow, holistic and forward thinking or whatever it is we want to, all this kind of positive language, and then to alienate the other and say that it's somehow, oppressive and, power hungry, that feels like that's not going to lead us into a place where we can come back into that connectivity. And so I'm just wondering, I'm interested to get into the conversation about corn, which I'm sure people are thinking, what?
Yeah.
Why are we going to start talking about corn? But I think it's really fascinating about how are we going to keep from reinforcing that division that we have now by using a language or, even, promoting an ideology that says one is worse than the other or somehow one is better.
Yeah. I think that's the first step out and it's something we all are really stuck in. And to me, it's very frustrating because I see it as stuck when either side says, no, I have the answer. I'm right and you're wrong. I'm right and you're wrong. And, I lean one way politically quite strongly, and it would be easy for me to say that too. It's not that I don't have any part of me that feels that way, but I just deeply feel that is the stuckness. That's the exact stuckness that we have to get out of. So when I say a conversation, I mean both sort of philosophically, theoretically, and I also mean like in a pretty literal way. We have to remember how to converse with one another. Like the two sides they're both stagnant, they're both stuck, and we really have to find some way to reconnect. And it means both sides have to kind of face the fear of losing some of their fundamental values. And I think both sides really contribute to the stuckness, which is why I so often say I work like with social issues and political issues, but I don't do politics. I don't talk politics in my work. I do in my personal life because we get too quickly divided. And that's, I think, the biggest problem we have with moving forward. I think sometimes that's said with kind of this sort of hippy-dippy softness. Oh, we're just, we need more love, more softness. And I actually don't even think that the softness is the issue. I think that just being forthright and genuine in conversation will spark forthright, genuine conversation back, and just finding a way to drop the judgment and drop out of our intense ideologies and say, I'll put myself out there. That's it. You don't even have to, I don't even think you have to be that nice about it. I think you have to be authentic. I think you have to be, thoughtful, and you have to be willing to just step out of your comfort zone. And both sides are really, there's a lot of work we have to do there. And that's why I think, I don't think we're getting very far until that happens.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you. So how does corn help us get there?
So corn, and it is so funny. I'm so accustomed to thinking about it now, but it is like, wait, corn, how could that be relevant? And the fact of the matter is that corn is central to virtually every culture every indigenous culture in the Americas, and in Central and North America. Corn is what I found when I really dug into Maya and Aztec and, that region, Mesoamerica, is that corn wasn't just a crop that's the staple of their food, which that's how we usually understand it. Well, of course they loved corn. Of course they worshiped corn. It's their main food. And yes, true. But there's actually something much deeper in the way that these cultures understand corn and have for a very long time, which is corn is actually... the way I can understand it is it's a symbol of all life. Corn in itself as a plant is self-pollinating. So it's male and female in itself. And that has to operate in a way where those two pieces are in communication in order to procreate, in order to create the next thing, the next life. It has to go through the entire cycle of pollination and death and seed back in the ground and growing. And there are many parts to it. But what I began to understand is for Mesoamericans, corn is a symbol that's like the manifestation of a central part of their worldview of the fact that everything is in cycle. Everything is constantly moving. We have an expression of one principle and then the other, and they go back and forth, and everything is in movement all the time. So that's where I really get to the wasteland idea that stagnancy is the end. Stagnancy has to be remediated because it's the end of culture. It's the end of the cosmic cycle. If it's stagnant, everything's over. And that's the way the Mesoamericans would really see it. You can see that in the expression of corn. Corn would just die. But if corn doesn't die, if it has the proper conversation, if it has the elements interacting and conversing, and working together and playing their parts, which isn't to say they're both equal at all times. There's an expression of the feminine, there's an expression of the masculine, there's a death, there's a rebirth. It's not just flatline. It's not just a constant harmony throughout all times. It's all changing, but everything has its moment to have its expression. And that's really a symbol of ourselves and our own life cycles and the life cycles of our cultures and our societies. And if you sit with corn Mesoamericans often talked about corn people are corn, cultures are corn, and we're kind of like, that's weird. I don't understand that. But when you really see what corn is, that it's this symbol. It's almost like I think of it as like a mandala. That's a similar thing. Mandala is a moving piece of art that has the world expressed through it and then gone. And there's something about the actual fact that it comes and goes that is really why it's such an expression of life at its truest form.
That's really beautiful. That's incredibly beautiful. And so I'm assuming that from looking at your work that when you talk about corn consciousness, you're talking about us having an awareness about these cycles and about this interplay and the time for, these things to rise and fall, death and rebirth. Am I reading that correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. And then there's an even more kind of radical edge to it that I picked up on when I started doing my work. I was influenced by other writers and other people kind of in the Chicano studies field who already were talking about corn culture and have been for decades as kind of a way to talk about the repressed cultures, and particularly Latino cultures, Latinx cultures that are repressed in Americas, and there's an essence that just can't quite be integrated into dominant society. And I picked up on the idea through these writers that corn culture is actually like a radical counter colonialist narrative. Like that I have read through this, very kind of starting in the 70s, like very 70s activist Chicanos, and so much of my interest was in finding ways to elevate these unheard voices. And I was very interested in my research to try and find ways to talk about the narratives that are present now. It's present in the Americas, present in our country, that we really never make room for. And so corn and corn culture, and I go to corn consciousness because it's a little something you can kind of take more personally, but that's present still. It exists around us, and it actually has this radical tone of a very radically different way of doing things. When other people talk about corn culture, they usually mean societies that rallied around corn or that had corn as central, which is my same topic of interest. But for me, I'm more interested in really what exactly is the role that corn is playing and how is it doing it in society. Like, I really like to get into that technicality, and that's how I find this discussion of these principles talking. But I'm really just playing off the idea that corn culture is is really what can take down colonialism in this country. If colonialism goes away, we'll have the question, many of us talk about anti-colonialism. Colonialism disappeared tomorrow, and everything that's colonialist disappeared tomorrow, which it won't, probably ever. But the question would be, then what? What's the narrative? So the argument that I see, that I'm hopping on board with, is that corn culture, corn has a narrative attached to it. It's a Mesoamerican narrative. It's indigenous to this ground that we all live on. It's in all, corn is, again, throughout all of North America. All the tribes worship corn. And that actually is this profound thing that talks about a new way to live that is more deeply inclusive, communal, moving, just, and it attaches this whole way of being that was the way of being on this continent, and it can still really influence us now.
Well, I'm interested to hear what you have to say about, or expound on, or kind of bring forward here, because I'm sure you've written about it at length. But just as I'm listening to you talk and talk about colonialism and what we've done to corn, and how, our culture and American culture has taken corn and done this kind of like almost I don't even know what to call it, this like abhorrent, perverted version of corn, and the, corn syrup and, all of these things that we have done. So I'm really interested to hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, you can see it all if you just trace corn as a crop, you can see the whole story in a nutshell, going from the most sacred thing on the planet, literally, Mayan communities, if you dropped a kernel of corn, you would have to go through a little bit of a ritualistic cleansing process because corn is so sacred. And to, fast forward into today's treatment of corn, which corn has been the backbone, food-wise, to the American diet, of North America forever. Not quite forever, but for a very long time. We've always consumed a ton of corn, but now what have we done to it? We've taken this most sacred substance and we have done what the colonialist myth tells us to do. That's reiterated and in the Bible, that says we have dominion. Corn is no longer sacred in and of itself. We don't listen to what corn tells us. No, now we are the top. We humans, we say, how can you work for me, corn? It's a totally out of balance. It's a very masculine practice to say, what can you do for me? It's not completely wrong. There's a place for that, but at an extent, it gets out of control. But to say, what can you do for me, corn? And then to the point where we have stripped corn of its, varieties. I mean, it's hard to even find most varieties of corn. The vast majority, it's like you have to really find some special person who cares enough to have grown the heirloom corn, and then we pump it full of GMOs just to make it work for us more, just to make it more productive, more goal serving. All of these are very colonialist and hyper masculine values to this extent. And why? So that we can pump our animals' bellies full of corn to make them almost superficially full so they get fatter. And then what happens in the meantime? We've actually lost nutrients. Our food's actually far less nutritious exactly because of our treatment of corn. It's filled with these corn substances that we have destroyed in our kind of inability to reel in our just need to make everything more productive and more serving. So we're really working against ourselves. That's what happens. That's a wasteland quality right there. It's actually ultimately very destructive, not only to the earth, but to ourselves.
This seems like a very colonial narrative, the myth of colonialism playing out just very evidently in the way you described corn.
Yes.
That's fascinating.
Totally. I mean, you can see it. And these are the things that I like to do in decolonizing narratives, or take these little tidbits and say, well, here's the narrative. Yeah, here it is right here. And not that there's, in balance, things like asking questions, what can you do for me, or goal orientation, or trying to make something as effective as possible aren't wrong. But the thing is that our society is completely dominated by those things, and you're feeling no trace in our narrative and our shared practices. Though a lot of people feel drawn to these things in their personal lives, they just don't find a collective space of saying corn is actually sacred. What can corn tell us? Where it might, the extreme other iteration of this would be, what can corn tell us? And that's also, what can the earth tell us? What can other things tell us? What might we not know? Where is it time to let go? Where is it time for us to not be leading the way and trying to make something happen at all times? And those are the sorts of questions that start to bring us into the balanced place and start to have an opening for the feral femininity, and start to cue in the other side of the corn symbol and the corn plant. And, even just saying those things, I can feel in my body a shift of a little more balance from the how, more, to the, wait, world, earth, corn, do you have something to tell me? And it seems like a silly question, but I think that most of us in our most personal moments know that it's not. Many of us know that there's wisdom that we're not hearing, and it's hard to know how to get there.
So what would you say that the corn consciousness, or corn itself at its root, is symbolizing, if we were going to use a word to say, it is symbolizing what? It is symbolizing the resilience and the life force.
Yeah, I would say that it's symbolizing the cosmic cycle that we're living in. It's symbolizing harmony and balance, but I also think it's really important to understand that harmony and balance do not mean peace exclusively. Harmony and balance include that peace and, this gets trickier, but peace and war to some extent. Like there's the war spiritedness, not that we should go to, create World War III, but that's also balance. There's a healthy expression for these things. So it symbolizes, cosmic consciousness, the cosmic cycle that we're all living in. It symbolizes the balance of a life, well lived, an authentic, fulfilling life, both communally and individually. It symbolizes also us as being a part of, remembering that we are a part of nature and a natural conversation, and that humans actually, we don't always have to be running the show, and it's not, we're not actually really deciding the future of the world anyways, even if we think we are.
Because of this, I'm just thinking, because of the state that corn is in, that we've been talking about, and this colonialization of corn, this weird, almost, I'm thinking about Frankenstein right now. Like we've just turned it into some kind of strange creature, right? This strange sort of manifestation of it. But do you think that that force just cannot be suppressed, cannot be killed, that it will regenerate and it will find its true expression again? Or do you think that humanity just it is in human nature to be so destructive that we will continually play out or suppress these ideas?
No, I don't think I don't think it's in human nature to be where we're at, to be destructive to the level that we're at. I think it's in human nature to be somewhat destructive, but that's also why almost all cultures, until, the more colonialist ones, have a pretty strong practice of some level of, self-reflection, because it needs to be countered. But a lot of times, maybe we'll get wise enough to remember that we have to have that self-reflective piece built into culture. But to answer the question more directly, it will. The feminine aspect, the other aspect, will rise. That's how I read it. That's how I read. I've been steeped in Mesoamerican philosophy. It's brilliant. These thinkers are brilliant, and they're very wise. And when I take their ideas to other myths and the stories of other cultures, what I see is, it will balance out. Whether it will be us really saying it's time to make a change and I want to move forward, and we are going to figure out a way to get reconnected to each other and change our value system, or it's a longer, harder road, we'll get there one way or the other. And that's the feral femininity. Feral femininity says, you can either get on board or you can just stay in my path and I'll wipe you out, because that's what femininity does. That's almost like a mama bear energy. It's like, this is happening. Feral femininity is caring for the earth, and it's taking care of the cycle. There's a feminine aspect, a mothering aspect, to say this is coming, and it's coming no matter like if you want it or not. There's we know as mothers, it's like, if you're protecting your your baby, you're going to mow some people down to get there. So you can either move out of the way or not. And that's kind of the where we're at right now. It will change.
And this is the work that you're doing. There's a quote here from your website that says, socially charged, this project that you're talking about, this decolonizing narratives, does not adhere to a political party or ideology, but commits philosophically only to the spirit of fierce, unapologetic love, regeneration, and the coming of a new era. And this is kind of what I hear you saying about this feral femininity. It's that unapologetic love.
Yes. Yes, and I think that's so important because I see these conversations all the time that say, "Hey, what you just said made me uncomfortable. That's not love. That's not loving." And it's something that just I see constantly, this idea that love and loving things need to be soft and essentially placating, and that's kind of part of the toxic masculine expectation. And my response to that's why I say these like fierce and unapologetic love, because I feel deeply that where I'm coming from is a place of love. I love culture. I love, you know, I love many people, and I guess I, love everyone, but I'm trying to do my part to bring us to a new era of justice, because I feel so much love for the people that have been kind of pushed to the margins. And I feel that a love for all of us that would really actually benefit and be in a better world if we weren't marginalizing others. And I think that it's come to a time where the fight for that has to be radical, and it's in your face, and it can't really be that soft anymore. And yeah, it's interesting because it is, it's feminine. But I'm so deeply influenced by so many male thinkers and so many men who I actually think are very much on the same train. And I would say that, I'm really influenced by people like Nietzsche and Heidegger and Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote extensively on the problematic elements of American democracy. And I mean, all these are very white male European thinkers, and I have a lot of relationships with women of color and indigenous thinkers as well. But I feel that a lot of these people are actually representing feral femininity. So again, it's not about women. It's not about everything being feminized and soft. It's just about making way for a new voice that says something different, and it's a message we need to hear. And even just creating that space is an essentially feminine action. And it's a strong, fierce feminine action. It's that mama bear energy, that fierce, almost mother energy that says, nope, it's the time, and I'm going to create this space. And I see that as extremely loving. That to me is the fiercest, the strongest kind of love.
Absolutely. And I know that this is a time of mothering in your life, as a relatively new mother. Mm-hmm. And so I can see that intensity, you're really feeling that now. As a mother, you have this new appreciation for that feral feminine, right?
Yes. Oh my gosh, absolutely. I feel like motherhood, I mean, honestly, I feel like labor alone. The first day I was a mother of my first child, I now have two, a 1 and a 3-year-old. But that alone changed my entire orientation to the world. And really, though it took me years to unpack it, really gave me a sense of what feral femininity is. When I think what's feral femininity, I immediately go to labor. It's this wild, it's going to happen. I don't know how. I'm terrified. This is a crazy space. But here it comes. And there's something in that that's so beautiful and needed. And that energy is so needed right now, of just this creative birthing space. And that is, yeah. And, obviously as a mother too, there this concern mounts of the world that not only you live in, that you've accepted, but now I'm bringing up 2 little kids. I'm like, I'll be damned if they're going to be dealing with this shit when they're my age. Things have got to get better. But it's motherhood is fundamentally, I'd say actually it really brought me into my own academically, which is a strange thing. But, feeling that energy, that mother energy, and trying to find a way to weave it into my work and not push it aside or not work outside of it, but really say, yeah, I know this isn't really what you're looking for, academia in a lot of ways. And I know this is off-putting, and I know I'm kind of owning it in a way that a lot of people are uncomfortable with. But I feel like it influences everything I do and my ideas, and it's only added to my intellectual conceptions of the way the world works.
Oh, that's really interesting. As you were talking about labor and that intensity and how it completely shifted your whole, your whole orientation to life in general, I was thinking about what an ego shattering experience that is.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that it's all extremely ego shattering. There's just no I in it at a certain point. I mean, I think you really see the other end that is frankly, it is frankly kind of terrifying. I think that place where there's no ego and you can't find I, or the I is not the most important, or we can't create this idea that's just about I know everything, I can figure it out, which is very colonialist. And if you get into a political philosophy stance, that I is what drives Enlightenment theory. It's Descartes. It's what the foundations of our political orientation in this country. But when there's so much security in that, the I, and when you lose it, it's so scary. But you also feel this amazing thing that you can find in meditation or other places. That is the we, this amazing interconnection. This place where things could actually shift.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that you kind of referenced or indicated that in the process of this, coming motherhood and stepping into that and experiencing this in your life, all at the same time that you were at the pinnacle of your writing process through your dissertation work and all of these years of research, and this is all happening for you at the same time. So I'm really interested in how that transformation, your own personal transformation, took place. You becoming a mother, birthing not only your children but your life's work up to this point, honestly.
Yeah.
And then also navigating the very kinds of ideology that you're writing about in academia at that time, because you sort of indicated, like, I know academia, this is not exactly what you were expecting, but I'm coming with all of it. My kid's in tow, and here I am, and here it is. And I'd just like to hear you talk a little bit more about that process and how you were working through the very colonial, patriarchal system that you were writing about.
Yeah, it's really interesting for me, Angelina, because I actually am not someone who came to my work, and like I've said, I have a background studying like a bunch of old white guys. I love philosophy. I was deeply influenced by all these old European continental philosophers. They're just so much in my heart. They're all white dudes. They're all European, and that when I up until till I started my doctoral studies, really, or started master's studies, that influenced me so much, and they're still really with me. That is to say that I'm not someone who came to my dissertation or came to my work at all saying, I want to be radically feminine. Didn't even, I consider myself a feminist, but it really wasn't something I wore on my sleeve. I really identified much more with like intellectual components, and in some ways I felt okay with the traditional academics. It was really I never even meant to do much work with goddesses or anything. It just didn't really appeal to me at first. But when I got deeper into just what I wanted to do, which was really just to be radical, that's really what I feel. I feel that I have a very strong penchant for radically new ideas. I'm interested in really, I feel a deep sense of injustice in our society. I'm very committed to figuring out what that is and what we can do about it. And it was those ideas that started to lead me to this work. And then as I'm writing my dissertation and or really doing the research, I've become pregnant. I have my first child. 6 months later, I become pregnant again. I have my second child. So, I mean, that was the time that I was really writing. It was those years that I'm in the throes of motherhood, and I wouldn't have realized at the time how much it was affecting me. But the reality was that I didn't have a lot of help. So I had a lot of times where I'm doing these very maternal, feminine things, feeding my child, playing with my child and typing, talking into my phone while I'm bouncing my child, writing while I'm putting my kid to sleep. These things that and at first it felt so impossible. I'd say for years I trudged through, but I just felt like, oh, it's so unfair. Like, I want to be a mother, and I want to, I want to do this, and I love this, but I also want to be, in this intellectual world, and I want to have time to write about this stuff. And over time, just out of necessity, I found a way to do both. And what that ended up doing, was just radically affecting the way I approached my work. And I started to feel this energy of, I don't see eye to eye with all of these thinkers exactly the same way anymore. And I don't know that I really see the world the same anymore. And I guess as time went on, it became clear that I was more identified with some feminine figures and feminine thinkers. I was deeply influenced by like Gloria Anzaldúa, and started to sit with these other thinkers that I'm like, I love those ideas of all my continental philosophers. But when I read somebody like Gloria Anzaldúa, there's something that I can't deny it really speaks to in a different way. And that was a very feminine part of me. And my doctoral process was really trying to interweave all of those things. That's really what I was trying to do. I still loved the old ideas, but I didn't feel like they spoke to the now. And I felt a lot of fear because I did identify so much with like, oh, I'm good at philosophy, I'm good with political science, I can really slide by in, the academic world like that. But there came points where I started to say, it's not my home. That's not my home. And actually, this is my home. This is this place where I'm doing this much deeper, kind of darker, messier work with these feminine figures and with this really feminine approach. And I ended up using art as part of my methodology of trying to dive into even modern art to read old myths. It's complicated, but and that's very feminine, the feminine process. And I think I was so nervous about that. Honestly, I just felt like I could do it really well if I was just an academic. I can do academic really well, but I can't in my heart right now. I can't do the traditional academic really well. And what I'm writing is actually really confronting to a lot of the fundamental aspects of academia. It's confronting to a lot of people. It's confronting to our culture in some ways. And I just felt like this is what I have to do. And it's either going to fly or it's not. But, it's coming from a different place, and it's coming from a more real place now that I could feel all these sides of myself. I mean, the maternal and the feminine just more activated. I felt a strength in just being grounded in my truth.
All right, that dissertation process really becomes such an alchemical vessel, doesn't it?
Oh my God,
transformation,
yeah.
And really distilling you down into the core of who you are and what you're about. I mean, I just think that's it's really incredible that you found your way through all of that with everything that was happening. And I also, just here towards the end of our conversation, I'm interested then in the bridge that you're making with the mother work that you talk about on your website, based on what you've been talking about, based on this kind of these radical ideas. And then, so what is mother work?
Well, mother work is a term that's been used in the past, over the past few decades, by women of color to start to really claim a space for motherhood, largely in academia. So that's something I found after my dissertation, is that term being used, and in some of the like Chicana literature of these Chicana scholars I was reading, they would throw this around, and there was such a charged kind of place-making energy in it. And I loved that the way it was claiming a space for women. And I also thought it has so much to do with what I'm doing too. But it made me claim my motherhood more forward. And it helped me to say, yeah, I can be a scholar and a mother, not with, we often say with two different hats, but I'm trying to wear just one hat, it's a lot to juggle. It's very hard, but it's also saying, I don't have to pretend that I'm not a mother to be good at what I do. And in fact, the more that I bring my mother energy and my mother self and my mother perspectives to my work, the stronger it is. So it's really about creating this space in the world where we as mothers understand that our identity is unique. We often see it as something that we're isolated in, that can be something that compromises our career or our goals. And what I'm trying to do, I take other groups of women, and I use myth to help them kind of identify with mother work, which is to find how our identities now as mothers are different and radically different than they were before, radically different than they would have been if we didn't have children, but that there is this value and uniqueness and perspective and uniqueness and ability to connect with so many aspects of the world that you can't really have unless you're a mother trying to, that has gone through the process of feeling through these other people, because motherhood breaks you apart. It breaks your heart open for better or for worse. And we often see that as as something that should be hidden, or as something that draws value away. But actually, I think that heartbroken openness is really the seat of connectivity. And if we can claim our identities in motherhood and in that hugely feeling space that can be scary or dark, that's actually, I think it's the beginning of the new era itself. I think that's what will save us, is that kind of energy that can be activated in other people.
Oh, that's such a beautiful image. And as you were speaking, I was seeing, kind of going back to what you said before about corn, where the one kernel of corn falling into, if you dropped it, you would have to do a cleansing ritual. But seeing that kernel of corn as that heart brokenness that then seeds connectivity, I think that's just such a beautiful, beautiful image of the mother's heart being broken. That's a
very cool connection, Angelina. I like that. I always like bringing that, and it, just enhances my corn obsession. That is great. That's how I see it too. That makes a lot of sense. Your visual.
It's really beautiful. And I think this has been such an amazing conversation. I'm so glad that we got to come together. Congratulations on your doctorate, Dr. Bouck.
Thank you.
I'm just so thrilled for you and your beautiful family. And I cannot wait to see what is coming next for you and your work.
Thank you, Angelina. It's so cool to see what you're putting out there too, and it's so exciting just to see how the world is changing with these ideas that people you are starting to bring out and make available to other people. And I'm loving your podcast, and thanks for having me on. This has been really fun.
Thank you very much.
If you're interested in finding out more about Dr. Bouck's work on decolonizing narratives, go to her website, rosaliebouck.com, or look for her and Decolonizing Narratives on Instagram. You have been listening to Interspace with Angelina Avadano. My heartfelt gratitude and appreciation goes to my husband, David Needs, Senior Production Engineer. If you would like to learn more about me or my work, look for me on Facebook and Instagram, Dr. A. Avadano with Cicada Personal Metamorphosis. That's Cicada with a Y, C-Y-C-A-D-A. Or you can email me at dr.aavedano@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. This is Angelina reminding you that we're all connected.